I've touched on the ancient people who lived in France before their immigration. Apparently were converted to Catholicism from paganism around 800 or some early time after Christ. They brought that religion to Pennsylvania, to Frenchville. They couldn't bring much, but it's been noted elsewhere that they did bring some song pages from St. Mary's of the Assumption at Rougy and used that as song material when they gathered together on a Sunday in one of the houses in the neighborhoods. So in 1939, Father said that he wanted to have a big celebration of the centennial of the first church there in Frenchville, which was built in 1840. So my father, who was a good artist and interested in history too, volunteered to do some research about what kind of construction the church was. There wasn't any singular source of material for that, but there were still remaining a very small handful of old-timers in the area that had been born around the time of the church or maybe a decade after. So my dad and I accompanied him, visited, I remember 3 or 4 anyway, old men that were still mentally capable of remembering back in the middle of the 1800s, and I listened to their conversations at their homes when Dad was interrogating them about what they remembered. There was some discrepancy between the memories of several of them, but they did all agree that the church was made from logs and it was just a gable roof, and they estimated the size of the thing, and none of their memories totally agreed, but it made a basis for Dad to estimate a composite size and appearance. But the one thing that none of them agreed on, and I remember 2 of them were adamant about this, and that was the bell. Apparently they had a bell, and I don't know where they got it, but I remember that there was an adamant stand that the bell tower was separate from the church, a separate structure, I don't know, 20 feet high or something, but was a separate entity from the church. A couple of other ones insisted that the bell was mounted above the church in a steeple on top of the church. So my dad gathered all this information and made a drawing of what he thought probably was the most likely size, appearance, and the bell tower decision. And he made the decision to make it separate. Dad submitted the drawing to the priest, and he didn't hear any more about it one way or the other. And then when the centennial was in a full swing and there was a lot of advertising and so forth, his drawing appeared on those various advertisements and information. The drawing that he made had trees and shrubbery added, which he didn't add to it. And there was a name at the bottom corner of somebody from Erie, Pennsylvania, as the artist. And my dad never received a thank you or any sort of recognition for all the work that he did. And it took him a number of hours and time to drive around. Some of these people lived 20 and 30 miles away that he had interviewed. But as you'll hear in the later part of this video, that's not surprising. There wasn't a priest full-time at Frenchville for several decades after they arrived there. There was a periodic visit of a priest from Baltimore, where the chancellery for the diocese was located at that time. That was the only diocese in the United States, and various priests came through there and on missionary trips, and he'd take care of all the baptisms, and they as far as marriages were concerned, they did a temporary marriage ceremony locally without a priest, and then when the priest came through, they had it formalized in the church. And the same with baptisms and whatever. The traveling priest would catch up on all the necessary ceremonials to make everything legal and above board. But by 1860 or so, the decision was made that a priest would be permanently assigned to Frenchville area, along with two mission churches at Carthus and at Counts Mills, little towns about 7 miles away from Frenchville. Of course, the architecture was based on churches in France, because the people that moved from France to Frenchville really wanted the same architecture. And they wanted to make it out of stone too, or granite, or something more permanent than logs. But the soil around Frenchville didn't yield construction grade material. But miraculously, in the mountains, a couple or 3 miles north of Frenchville, a great granite outcrop was discovered, a rarity in that area. And pieces as long as 12 feet were quarried for the treads of the steps up at the front of the church, and the landing at the top of the stairs. All huge, beautiful single pieces. And of course, if you examine the rest of the construction of that church, you'll know and appreciate how much of a blessing that outcrop was for this construction, because the church is really as beautiful today as it was 150 years ago and more. And it was all volunteer labor. There was much interest and desire to have a beautiful church. It wasn't completed. It was dedicated in 1870, but the steeple part was temporarily enclosed, and a bell housed in this temporary structure, as you can see here. And then about 10 years later, enough funds were raised to construct the steeple and complete the church. A mystery about the painting inside the church exists today. I did a lot of research to try to find the background of this immense oil painting that hangs in the church today. You can see from this picture here. And I knew that the name of the church was taken from, was the same one as in Rougy, France, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the picture has been inside this church, or this painting rather, has been inside the church since its construction. I don't know when it was delivered from France and how it was done, because this is a large painting, 8 by 15 feet. While I was writing the long journey, I did some investigating of the origin of this painting, and I contacted the University of Louisville Art Department and also Penn State Art Department. The Louisville Art Department estimated that it was probably painted around the 16th century, and possibly by French artists in the Italian style. The Penn State University art director went to Frenchville and looked at it, and without a paint chip, she could not definitely determine the date of its painting, but she said also that it was probably painted in the 16th century. And she remarked about how well it was done, and especially the fingers and feet, which are, she claims to be difficult items to correctly paint. But anyway, stories that have been handed down, and I have no idea if there are any truth or not, but apparently it came over here in the mid-1800s, after being hung in Rougy Church for quite some number of centuries, maybe from its inception. I have no idea, but nevertheless, the story goes that during one of the invasions by the Germans, they cut it out of the frame and took it back to Germany. And the French discovered its location in Germany and surreptitiously went into Germany and cut it back out of the frame that they had it in and brought it back to Rougy, and subsequently then shipped it some way to Frenchville. This has been an awkward package to ship, particularly in the mid-1800s when sailing ships were small and leaky and wet and not equipped to haul packages 18 feet long, probably by maybe a foot or two in diameter. Obviously, it was rolled up for shipment, but the danger of it being bent or smashed or wet was pretty high. And of course, hauling it from Philadelphia or New York across the mountains without further damage, it was a pretty remarkable transposition from northeastern France to the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania in the mid-1800s. It's remarkable that it ever arrived. I mentioned earlier that a Mr. Kading acquired ownership of a large segment of Pennsylvania. And in 1837, he sold 30 acres to the Bishop of Baltimore for $1 for the location of the church and the cemetery there in Frenchville. And I've already talked in earlier videos about my confirmation and First Communion, so I won't repeat that here. This is the ambience of my childhood. This church and its ceremonies and so forth before the renovations of the 70s, the Latin Mass, the confessions before Mass. This video is an attempt to give the Catholic religious ambience of my childhood at Frenchville. And I'm sure it's not typical of the rest of the world. There were few weekly communicants. Most people went 2 or 3 times a year at the most. And the choir, I remember the choir in the balcony singing various songs, the primary one being, "Lord, I am not worthy." The songs and the prayers of the Mass were on a solid piece of printed cardboard that each worshiper followed along. It didn't vary any that I can remember. But some other things that are still in my memory of the religion there in Frenchville and are unique, certainly in today's parishes, but were, I think, fairly unique to Frenchville too. One of them was pew rent. Every pew had a little 2-inch by 2-inch brass bracket hanging on the end of the pew, and this little bracket retained the name of the pew renter. The pew rent was $1.50 per person per year, and you could pay rent on 1 seat, 2 seats, or 4 seats, and each pew held 4 payable seats. Apparently the children didn't have to pay. This listing here shows the number of seats that each family bought. There was some controversy about this in the 2 missionary churches. One of them refused to do it, and the other one decided to pay 10 cents every Sunday. But Frenchville hung on to it as long as I was ever a member there. Pity the poor bugger that deliberately or accidentally sat in a rented pew that wasn't his. There is a God, and he took him off. You do that's for sure. Then the other interesting page that I want to show you here is the monthly contributions were published in the bulletin that Father had printed every month. It was in the form of a 4 or 5 page newspaper kind of thing, but every person that donated or didn't donate, I guess his name didn't show up, accusing enough finger, I guess. As you can see, the top dog paid $5.50 a month, but there were three. There were two brothers and a father, so there were really three. So they each paid less than $2 a month. I put the number of amounts that each paid pencil there, but you can see that the most that any family, single family, paid was $2 a month. Now, it seems like this is a pretty tiny little amounts, but you've got to remember that this was 1939 and 40 results, and this didn't come easy. He had already been there 3 or 4 years, and this is the best he could do. And if you had to know him to know how a powerful a man he was, and if that's all he could get, believe me, that's all he was going to get, and no matter what he did. But it was a sacrifice for families to even pay that. When you haven't worked for a long time, when work is absolutely unavailable, and the only way you can get any money is to maybe sell some vegetables or find a few days' work on the road at 35 cents an hour or so. These are not insignificant gifts, and it has to be taken into perspective. As I previously mentioned, Mom was a convert from the Methodist Church. In those days, Dad, as a Catholic, couldn't marry a Protestant without at least her promising to raise the kids as a Catholic, but preferably that she convert. She always went to church. There was never a moment's hesitation about getting dressed and going to church, and in those days, everybody wore their best rags to church. There was no shortcutting, no jeans, no flip-flops or shorts or anything. You dressed modestly in your best. The women all wore head coverings, so it was a very formal and solemn and serious event to go to church. In those days, before 1962 anyway, or 65, the Latin Mass was the only Mass, and so all the prayers were in Latin, done to a very precise and prescribed schedule. There was no deviation in the way the Mass was said in those days. A priest wouldn't dare do that. And so Mom participated in attendance. I don't remember of them going to communion, but I'm sure they did. As I think back, there wasn't anybody in that whole community that was educated. Well, there wasn't anyone there, other than the priest, of course, who was extensively trained in the seminaries. There wasn't any catechesis that I know of. The only preparation for religious education were the 2 summers that I went to the catechism classes for a 6-week period. First time was to go and learn about God for First Communion. The study book was just a little blue pamphlet, not very large and not very thick either. And the second series of education was for confirmation a few years later, and it was just 6 weeks. So you can imagine how profound all that education was for me as a background in the Catholic Church, and knowing what it was and what it was about, and so forth. We did learn the fundamentals of God loves us and why we were made, and a couple of things like that, but it was really pretty thin gruel. So I don't know that Mom got any at all. She never went to the catechism classes. But anyway, Mom I'm certain didn't have any as much as I did in terms of education, and I don't know that Dad ever had any either. Perhaps when he was a child, the old priest that was there had classes, but I really doubt it. And so I grew up totally ignorant of the majesty and the solemnity and the importance of the Mass and all the historical 2,000 years of teachings and studies and writings by numerous saints and martyrs, and I knew nothing about that. I never read the Bible. We had a Bible at home, but it never was read. I remember where it was kept, in a drawer in one of the dressers in the bedroom, and I remember opening it up one time, but it was just a matter of curiosity that I did that. One thing, though, that was predominant was the rigorous discipline that was imposed. During Mass, it was absolutely forbidden to whisper or talk or make noise or do unnecessary activity. kids were expected to be silent. After a certain age, probably First Communion, boys sat in the first few rows of pews up in the front of the church on the right side, and the girls sat on the left side in the front pews. The kids then were isolated from their parents at a fairly early age, and we all towed the line because there were consequences for disobedience. I remember one that was a salutary training session. There was one boy, and his name was Thomas McGovern. I suppose he was hyperactive. He was a little different. I don't know what was the problem with him, but he couldn't sit still. And he was always doing something, making noise and whispering and talking. Finally, one day during Mass, Tom had done something extraordinarily loud, and Father just turned around right from the altar and pointed his finger at him, and he said, "Thomas, leave the church now." So a very embarrassed Tom had to get up and walk all the way down the aisle to the back of the church, and he went outside. That was a scary moment for all of us. It had a lot of unintended consequences. After church, all the parishioners congregated outside in front of the church. The men would gather and congregate in their various groups or friends and whatever, and talk. And of course the women did the same thing. And it was all in French. There may have been somebody speaking English, but it would have been only to Mom, as far as I know. There were a couple of women that spoke English, and Mom got acquainted with eventually. And I'd stand there with my dad, listening and waiting for him and his buddies to be done talking. Then, of course, it began to break up after, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20, 30. I really don't remember. It varied, I'm sure. I do remember one time, though. I must have been, let's see, it must have been 1938. And the reason I remember is because my brother was born in 1938. And I'm standing there, 9 years old, listening and all that, and Dad and his buddies are joking, and Dad said that his back was been bothering him lately, and I remember one of the guys said, "Well, it's no damn wonder." And I didn't realize it, but Mom was pregnant then, and they all got a big laugh out of that one. But of course, I was totally a dumb bunny, and I had no conception whatsoever of what the joke was. I remember Ambrose Ruggie had an old, it was a teen years Ford. It was a touring car with a convertible top, I remember. Driver's side had an imprint in the side of the body, but didn't have a door there. And I have no idea why Henry Ford didn't put a door on that side, but I remember Ambrose would lean over from the ground to the steering wheel and adjust the spark and the throttle, because it didn't have a starter on it, and he had to start it with a crank. So he would set the levers at the position that were supposed to be for starting. Then he'd go around to the front of the car and reach down behind the bumper and get a hold of the crank handle. The crank stayed in the front of the car through the radiator all the time. He never removed it. But anyway, he'd lean down and position the crank and engage it into the crankshaft, and he'd give that a few vigorous turns, and it would fire and make some racket. He'd run around to the side of the car and grab the lever on the steering wheel and spark lever to get the old engine going, and it would cough and sputter and finally start roaring. And then he'd put his hands on the side of the body above where the door would be in the window. There weren't any windows in the car. And he'd swing his whole body up over the side of the car and plop right down into the driver's seat. His father always rode in the front seat. He was a tall, handsome man, I remember. He always wore a pearl gray Stetson hat. A very imposing and majestic-looking man in my eyes. On the days when it would be raining and so forth after Mass, they'd all go over to the porch of the schoolhouse adjacent to the church at that time, out of the weather. I thought a lot about relating following incidences that happened to me, because I don't want to be defamatory or critical of our pastor. But they did have an impact on my relationship with the church, and I think they're important to the whole story that I want to give. So now I'm going to take the risk of not being loving or whatever, or merciful, or whatever you want to use to describe these events. And I want to say that our pastor was a young man. This was his first assignment in a place that was at least 4 hours drive from his home in Erie and his mother, and who he was very close to, over dirt roads the whole length, 150 miles. And the place didn't have electricity or paved roads or telephone. And he had two outlying missionary churches to attend to, too, each about 7 miles in opposite directions from each other. And he had a population there that was essentially still foreign, in the sense that they'd been isolated for practically 100 years at that time, and still hung on to the mental attitude of peasant France. And in all three places, the churches were in terrible condition. They hadn't been maintained. The previous pastor had been there for 30 years, and he was an old man when he died, and maintenance and all the normal upkeep had not been done. And of course, the church wasn't heated. It didn't have a furnace in it or anything, except a pot-bellied stove up on the front side altar that really was totally ineffective in warming that huge volume. And the rectory adjacent to the church there was in shambles and full of mold, and it was a very depressing place for him. And he admitted in more than once that he didn't want to come there. In fact, he returned to Erie after his assignment and had made a decision to quit priesthood, but he submitted to the bishop and returned. But still, he was an unhappy man there. He ruled with fear, and he had his own favorite people eventually there in the parish, and he drew a very clear line between the favored and the unfavored. And of course, my family and me were the unfavored. At least that's the impression that I have today, and I think it's fair. But I never held any animosity toward him. I was afraid of him. I cringed when he looked in my direction, and believe me, there was no sense of impertinence or rebellion or independence when you were around him. He ran the communities with an iron hand. He was the top dog in that whole area, and you didn't forget it. And he had a bearing of superiority, and he was a big man, 6'2", maybe, something like that, and he was pretty heavy too. He wasn't a muscular, athletic type at all, but he was smart, and he was domineering. And I'm not saying that, I'm not revealing these in a sense of retaliation or anger or any residue of anything, really. I think they're kind of funny, actually, and today's, in my view, and he imposed a sense of fear, and I wasn't about to make any smart aleck remarks or attitude toward him. I was a very submissive, and as I said, afraid, and I walked on tenterhooks whenever I was in his presence. But regardless of what I guess some would consider these to be negative stories about him, he really was a perfect man to be at Frenchville at that time, from a secular standpoint at least. All the deficiencies that I mentioned, lack of telephone, electricity, pavement, lack of maintenance, everything that I mentioned here as the situation that he faced when he arrived there. He was an aggressive and clever man, and he got the state and the electric company and so forth all into action. And it wasn't long before every one of these negative situations was corrected, and or else well on its way in just a few years. He he brought the finances of the church back into condition, and he was really the spark plug that that place needed to get back into reality and modern age that he was sent there. He deserves a lot of credit for the enormous amount of improvements that he made and the survival of that church. So, based on these few number of words, I want to paint the background of the whole situation as best I can. And, I'm going to proceed with these stories that I really find amusing, and I hope you do too. I hope you take them in the sense that I'm trying to express them here, because they were part of the formation of my life. Is a story of an incident that happened in the spring of probably 1939, when I was 11 or 12 years old, sometime in that period of my life. I was an altar boy and one of 26, and our pastor promised to take us to Clearfield to a movie. The big day arrived. It was a Saturday, and the bus was to leave the post office in Frenchville at 10:30 in the morning, and so that was the collection point. That was about 2.5 miles from my house, so, and I had to walk it. So that morning, I started plenty early, fortunately, as events turned out. The last thing I want to do was miss that bus. So I was dressed in my finest outfit. About a third of the way to Frenchville, I just descended the steep Bergy Hill, which no longer exists because of the strip mining and the recontouring of the landscape because of that destructive process. But in those days, that hill was notorious for being difficult to climb and a little snaky to descend too if it was slippery. There's a curve in the middle of it, and it was about a third or a half mile long, something of that nature. It was long enough to give us some real difficulty. But nevertheless, I descended the hill to the little bridge that crossed the stream at the bottom, a little wooden plank bridge. I was climbing up the other side of this little valley. The road on this side of the bridge climbed rather gently for a few hundred yards, and then had a very sharp, abrupt but short hill, and then it leveled off at the top. Apparently it was the edge of a little strata of limestone or something, because of the way it came up, and it sharply leveled off at the top. Anyway, I'm up over the bridge, and I'm approaching like the base of this short little abrupt hill when I heard a car coming down Bergy Hill, and I could tell the way it was coming that it was somebody that was a total dummy of how to tackle this road and successfully make the grades without getting stuck back there in those boonies. But this car crept down that Bergy Hill very cautiously and crossed the bridge slowly and started up the side that I was on, and I knew he was never going to make it. The roads were muddy, and you needed momentum to make this final little upward surge to get to the top, flat area where you'd be safe. I saw it was a big 41 Chrysler Imperial Club Coupe, beautiful machine, big straight 8-cylinder job. As it crept by me, I stepped back out of the road onto the bank into the edge of the woods to escape being splattered with mud and water in the ruts. It crept by me slowly, and I saw it was, well, he didn't look at me or acknowledge me. He just kept grinding along, and the wheels spinning, and he got to this little sharp uprise, and that was the end of it. He had almost made it, but there was no hope for him. And of course the road was narrow and muddy, and backing up was a little hazardous, because if he got in a ditch, he'd really be stuck. So he stopped, and he leaned out the car, and he was a corpulent man. And he couldn't turn around and look at me. He just leaned out the car and shouted, how about a push? So I got behind him on the bumper or the trunk lid there, and he gunned that engine something, all for all it was worth. And I pushed, and by golly, the car started to move a little bit, inch by inch, and the front wheels then came over the top of that sharp little edge on the top of that hill, and now it all remained was for the back wheels to get up there. And he was just flooring it. The tires were smoking, and all of a sudden, the car swerved sideways. And of course, as I was pushing, there was a rooster tail of mud coming out from behind the rear wheels and flying on each side of me. But I was safely between the alternating rooster tails. But when it got to the top, and the car skidded sideways, that rooster tail just swiped me full blast from the left rear wheel.
But it gave him enough momentum
for those back wheels to get up over the edge of that outcropping, and he was up on the top, safe. But he kept on going. He never stopped to say thank you or boo or anything. And there I stood with my dress clothes on, and I was swiped from head to foot with a layer of wet mud. Well, there wasn't any way I was going to be able to go to movies in this condition. So I still had time. I still probably had an hour anyway, maybe more, probably more than that actually. But in any case, I decided to go home, and so I turned around and went back up that Bergy Hill at record speed. I ran most of the way back home as much as I could. My mother helped me clean up and change clothes and got dressed again, and I suppose that took maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I have no idea. But I had really given up on the idea of trying to catch the bus. But as my mother encouraged me to try, there was still time to do it. So, boy, I took off with running and walking as fast as I could. And I got into Frenchville, and I could see the bus parked in front of the post office. The post office was up on top of a grade hill, and you could see it from some distance. But the bus engine was running. I could see the exhaust smoke coming out the tailpipe. So I knew that the bus driver wouldn't be starting the engine very much before the time that they were going to depart. So I started to run and waving my arms. I guess somebody saw me and they waited, but I came that close to missing that bus. But I did make it, and got to Clearfield and went to the Ritz Theater, and I have no idea what movie we saw. But after the movie, surprise of surprises, he announced that he was going to take us into the Ritz drugstore that was adjacent to the theater. And drugstores in those days were ice cream dispensers as well as drugs. And they had a long counter, and they had sandwiches too. You could eat in there. But they had ice cream of all kinds. So we went in and sat down, and the waiter came around to ask what we wanted. I had no idea. I'd never been in a place like that before. And I thought, well, I'll just have the same thing Father has. I didn't want to order something expensive either. I didn't want to be in any trouble. So he ordered a Mexican sundae. So I said I'd have the same thing. As it turns out, it was a pretty simple thing. It was just ice cream with roasted peanuts on it. I was a little disappointed because one of the kids next to me had ordered a milkshake, and it came with they served a can that they had blended it in along with a glass, and I could see this delicious looking chocolate mixture in there. But anyway, I decided, boy, the next time I get 15 cents together and I'm in Clearfield, I'm going to have one of those. And that's what I did too. It was some time later. I have no idea when, but I happened to be in Clearfield, and I had the 15 cents, so I went in the drugstore there and ordered one of those. Boy, I still love them. I've had a lot of them during my lifetime. But in any case, it was not an example. I thought, I think in retrospect that a priest should have given. The fact that he didn't even say thank you or wait to see what had happened to me was It was kind of bad. I guess I became an altar boy probably in 1938 or something like that. 39 maybe. 38. That would make me 9 years old. Yeah, maybe even earlier than that. I'm not sure. 37 maybe. Whatever. It doesn't matter. But anyway, Father wanted things done right from an appearance standpoint. He was very ritually nitpicky. He liked vast numbers of priests and altar boys on the altar, crowds of people, all performing various functions or just sitting there looking pious or whatever. He liked ceremony. That's the correct word. So, and of course, he wanted perfection from his altar boys. There was no screw ups during these services he had. And you know, for example, midnight mass lasted a couple hours. He managed to tack on enough extra stuff and ceremonies and sitting and standing and whatever to stretch it. He was in his glory with that type of thing. And of course, us altar boys had to sit in the front pews. There wasn't enough room on the altar for 26 altar boys and 8 or 10 priests and stuff. He invited every buddy priests of his from North and South Pole to come there during these ceremonies, and he managed to put on a good feed for them too. They all knew they'd eat well and drink well. I remember the centennial of 1940. He had a circus come with Ferris wheels and big picnic. Everybody in the countryside came for miles, and he had set up a big tent. And the reason I know this because I peeked in to see what was going on in there. And this tent was long, maybe 50 feet long anyway, and there were tables down the center of this thing, and these tables were loaded with bottles of booze, wine, all kinds of stuff, and all kinds of food, big piles of meat, well, whatever it was. And it was restricted only to those he invited. And of course, all the visitors that he had invited were automatically members of that elite cloud. And certainly, if there were any from Frenchville invited to that little orgy in there, I don't know of any. Certainly, my folks weren't part of that celebration. But the ceremony in the church, it was beyond elaborate. It lasted. It may still be going on. I don't know. I know I was an older boy, and oh gosh, it lasted minimum 2 hours. And in any case, that's an aside. That had nothing to do with what I was saying here. Anyway, in preparation for all these elaborate ceremonies, the elder boys had to be on their toes. Had to be sharp. A sharp operation. And one of the sharp operation necessities was knowing your Latin prayers. Those prayers were all repeated out loud where others could hear. And if you didn't know what you were repeating or what to say, it became pretty obvious. And you wasn't having any of that. It behooved you to learn those prayers without error if you wanted to avoid a nasty word or look. I mean, a look from him was enough to melt a piece of stainless steel. So anyway, we had to learn these prayers, and I'm not complaining about the fact that we needed to learn them. It was part of the Roman Mass. And I wasn't resentful about learning them. I did learn them. But we had to go there to the church on Saturday afternoons for quite some time, a lot more than for First Communion and Confirmation. I guess probably 10 or 12 times we had to meet in the church on a Saturday afternoon and practice our Latin. I didn't have any great deal of difficulty learning the prayers, but some of the kids, just had some problems with it. So I remember this one Saturday, we were all sitting in the left-hand row of pews. And since I was one of the younger ones, I was in the front row, or maybe the second row, and the older boys then all sat behind me. And there were about 4 or 5 rows of us, I guess. Quite a few, well, 26. And Father would stand then and facing us. And so he started in the back rows with the boys. They had to stand up, and I remember this day we were working on a confiteor. And he started in the back row, and each boy had to stand up and recite the confiteor. Most of them did pretty well. There were some that didn't, but I knew it. There was one kid sitting behind me, and a little off to my left, and he wasn't real smart. Yeah, but we were friendly, more or less, as friendly as I got with any of them. And so I was hoping he wouldn't screw up too bad. So I turned kind of sideways in the pew when it came his turn, and I watched him, and he didn't do very well. And boy, Father just really ate him a good one. And I really felt bad for him, but I thought the next kid next to him would be next. You know, I wasn't expecting what happened. He shouted, "John, stand up!" So I stood up, and he said, "Say the confiteor, and you'd better not make one mistake." He said, "If you can't pray along with the other fellows, but have to turn around and look back and can't pay attention, you're going to pay the price." So the Lord was with me that day. I rattled that thing off. I knew I really nailed it. And it made him mad. He turned to another kid and he said, "You." He didn't say a word to me. He didn't even tell me to sit down. Well, I didn't need a lot of hints about time to sit down, but boy, I really got under his skin that day. But life in a little town, I'll tell you, it was something else. I think we'll end this one here and we'll go to another one. You can stand it.